Welcome, everyone, and thank you, Neil and Amos, for the introduction. Welcome to Flagler County, Florida, which is just north of Daytona Beach and south of St. Augustine. We are a coastal community dealing with spring break and beachgoers who haven't quite grasped the idea of social distancing. So it's certainly been a challenge for all the coastal communities here in Florida. As the sheriff in Flagler County, and some of you may wonder how someone goes from a New York prosecutor to a Flagler County sheriff. That one you'll have to read my book. It's certainly an interesting story. But in any event, Flagler County is a community of about 125,000 people. As sheriff, I was responsible for patrol division, our security, courthouse security, inmate facility, emergency preparedness, and also communication. As sheriff, I had the dubious distinction of being a sheriff during my 8 years of having encountered 5 hurricanes and a tornado. So I've been through the preparedness portion of what we're about to talk about, and I believe that experiences is somewhat helpful in dealing with this crisis, which is about to unfortunately overwhelm almost all of our systems. It was certainly a day when that I'll remember when the governor at the time, Rick Scott, called me up and told me a Cat 5 hurricane was barreling down on Flagler County and was about to obliterate our Barrier Beach and some of our interior. That's, I think, how a lot of us feel right now, that we have a Cat 5 bearing down on us, and we're trying to figure out how to prepare ourselves adequately for such an event. So let me get into our presentation. And first of all, our country starts with one of the highest incarceration population of any country in the world. The next slide will show exactly what the proportion of people in jails: 1.3 in state prisons, over 600,000 in local jails, 200,000 plus in federal prisons, and in immigration detention facilities, for a total of more than 2 million prisoners. So that is the total population that we have to be concerned about spreading into those facilities where social distancing cannot be practiced. As we all know how jails are comprised, they are packed together as close as we can and housed as many people as we can. So this virus is certainly going to be a challenge for jail administrators and the public who will have to deal with the repercussions of this virus going through these jails and then back out into the public. County jails, in my opinion, are going to be most heavily affected simply because the turnover rate in local jails is so much higher than in state and federal prisons. Most of the people in the local jails are there for short periods of time and are cycling in and out based on bail or sentencing or pretrial issues. So clearly local jails are going to be the focus of a lot of the conversation we're having today on how we try to limit the spread of the virus in those jails and then back out into our community. We already have encountered numerous cases of staff and visitors testing positive from local jails and state and federal prisons. So this is a present problem, not a potential problem. It already is a problem, and it's about to get worse. As we probably realize that once it's inside the jail, it's going to spread like wildfire, simply because of the issues of hygiene and forcing the facilities to go into quarantine with little medical capacity. One of the breaking points may come is when the jails become overwhelmed with cases of coronavirus and the hospitals are overwhelmed. It may require local jails and state and federal prisons to also set up some triage or some local medical response on site because of the overwhelming issues that are confronting our local hospitals. So the spread of the within the correctional facilities are going to accelerate. We're just seeing the tip of the iceberg as we are in this country, and hopefully we can start taking some measures that will prepare us for this. The next slide, please, will show you that if not, to flatten this curve of the spread of the coronavirus will require all of our collective response, both outside in the public and also in public facilities, including jails throughout this country. So, next slide. The next slide shows you the potential for, without protective measures, without doing the kind of things we're going to talk about today, which is talked about daily through the CDC. That is the bell curve if we do nothing. With protective measures throughout our system, we can potentially flatten that curve and keep our healthcare system from being overwhelmed. Next slide. So one of the first things we can do is try to limit the people coming in and out of the criminal justice system and into our prisons. And so that's where law enforcement can certainly have a huge influence. One of the things we have to worry about is not only the health of our prisoners, but also our personnel, our law enforcement personnel in the streets, our personnel in the jails, our courthouse personnel as well. All of them are potential carriers and also are potential victims of the coronavirus. So clearly, what law enforcement needs to do right away is have this conversation about limiting contacts with the public, limiting stops, warrant enforcement where there is, and all of this is, if it doesn't have an effect on public safety, but to the extent possible, law enforcement in the streets on patrol need to immediately limit contacts with the public as much as they can. Also limiting the amount of people taken into custody. There should be discussions in every law enforcement agencies about what exact crimes they're going to enforce at this point, so we can limit that type of contact, and also limit people coming into the criminal justice system. Perhaps delaying arrests for nonviolent crimes, including drug offenses, theft, and prostitution. The Fraternal Order Police, one of the national police unions, supporting its decisions. Sheriffs are starting to admit only prisoners with violent charges that threaten public safety. We also can maximize the use of cite and release rather than making an arrest and putting them through the typical booking process and giving them appearance tickets for the minor and petty crimes to the extent that the law allows that. Specific jurisdictions are already using cite and release and have lowered offenses, cutting daily arrests by almost 80%. So that's the kind of result we want to see. We want to see those massive changes in how law enforcement is bringing potential law violators into the system. One of the other things that can be utilized where it is authorized is the use of civil citations. In Florida, civil citations are authorized by the discretion of police officer or deputies up to 3 instances for misdemeanor crimes. Civil citations completely take the person out of the criminal justice system and put it into a civil system. So civil citations should be maximized to the extent practical and possible. That would again cut down that amount of people coming into the system and having contact through the criminal justice system. Next slide. So as we can see from this pie, 76% of people held by the local county jails are not convicted of any crime. So they're not sentenced prisoners. They're simply being held pre-trial or pre-hearing on parole or probation violations. So this is a huge amount of our 2 million people that we're talking about who are incarcerated in our prisons. And this is a group that we should be identifying and determining whether we can safely move them out of the jail and safely into the community, so as to decrease the prison population and the possibility of coronavirus sweeping through those facilities and causing havoc in the jails and in the community. So some of the things that prosecutors and judges can consider doing is simply to decline or delay prosecution wherever is possible. Specific jurisdictions are declining to prosecute low-level offenses, including drug possessions and prostitution. Courts are delaying all non-essential cases. In Florida right now, all courts are not taking any hearings or trials. Only emergency hearings are being conducted. So there's lots that the court can do, along with prosecutors, to limit people coming into the system right now. Specific jurisdictions have stopped asking for bail for all nonviolent offenses. Also, judges are, where possible, are defaulting to non-custodial sentences. Also, they're declining to issue failure to appear warrants or bench warrants, or to vacate existing low priority warrants. Anything that requires law enforcement to seek out people who have warrants or seek them out to arrest them should be curtailed to the extent possible. Technical problems. Judges in specific jurisdictions have vacated over 10,000 warrants for unpaid fines and fees and failures to appeal, have stopped driver license suspensions, or have placed all warrants for nonviolent offenses on hold. If requested by defense counsel, judges are agreeing to waive clients' appearance or status court dates, another way to keep people out of the courthouse and potential exposure. Courts and court personnel are canceling all probation, parole, and pretrial meetings, court-ordered classes, in-person drug testing, collection of court debt, and modifying all reporting conditions and relying on phone reporting instead. Courts are canceling probation and parole revocation hearings based on technical violations upon request of defense counsel, releasing those held in custody pending hearings on signature bonds. These are all ways of keeping people out of the system and avoiding contact with court personnel and jail personnel. Next slide. Next slide. So how does this all work? Right now, we're going to need coordinated efforts at every single level of our governance. In this particular case, we're going to need the coordinated efforts of judges, prosecutors, sheriffs, jail administrators, and the local bar. During the hurricanes that, in preparation for the hurricanes that I dealt with, we convened these types of panels. What we did was as the jail administrator, we went through and reviewed those people in the inmate facility who could be released pre-trial, or who could be identified as either elderly or high risk, to cycle them out of the jail as quickly as we could. So I think that's one of the things that all communities should be doing right away, convening these kind of panels, identifying these people who are at risk, and with the court's approval and the prosecutor's approval, cycling these people out of the jail. Governors can also used clemency authority to also limit jail population in the state prison. As we indicated, a large portion of the prison population are pretrial. So in jurisdictions where where pretrial release programs are available, or where bond reform has taken hold, we can cycle those people outside of the prison by setting no bail or setting the pretrial conditions as requirements of their return to court without having to incarcerate them. When we did it in our county, we reduced our prison population almost 25%. So this would go a long way to reducing the prison population and the potential exposure of those prisoners to the coronavirus. Specific jurisdictions, courts are already holding mass bond hearings to reduce jail populations. DAs are filing motions or not opposing motions to release pretrial detainees facing misdemeanor or low-risk drug-related felony charges. As I said, we can be releasing these with the approval of the courts and the prosecutors, vulnerable populations, those with asthma, cancer, heart disease, lung disease, and diabetes. Specific jurisdictions, Board of Corrections have called for the immediate release of all high health risk inmates, and prosecutors have filed motions in support of release. In Congress, bipartisan House Bill 4018, which passed the House unanimously, would allow thousands of elderly federal prisoners to petition for transfer to home confinement. Home confinement is another way of releasing prisoners outside of the jail or not putting them in jail in the first place. Also, identifying prisoners who are persons in jail who are within 3 months of completing their sentence. Specific jurisdictions have released people who are within 30 days release or 45 days release. So we can limit incarceration of new people charged with offenses that do not involve serious physical risk to the community, while cycling out people who are at the end of their sentence. Again, all with the intent of trying to reduce our prison populations and again, reduce the risk of infecting those people while in jail. In specific jurisdictions, the DA has urged the release of everyone in jail for misdemeanor and nonviolent felonies, or will strongly consider credit for time served in plea deals so that more people can be released. Judges have held a special session to settle cases with guilty pleas and release more than 200 low-level nonviolent inmates. So these are the things that are already being done. It needs to be more concentrated, it needs more effort to continue to reduce the prison population. It goes without saying that hygiene is always pivotal when you're dealing with jails and putting people together in closed quarters. Jails, at the best of times, are high risk for disease and flu. In this particular circumstance, it's even more imperative that there's comprehensive sanitation, that the use of CDC recommended hand sanitizers, that medical care is being planned for and ramping up in medical care. In fact, even bringing back retired medical personnel, jail personnel to assist if that can be done. The cleaning of the facilities on almost an hourly basis, and transport vehicles, and using all the safety measures recommended by the CDC are paramount right now for jail administrators and sheriffs and court personnel and anyone dealing with the public or inmates. And also goes without saying that visitation, all visitation, in-person visitation, should be suspended at this point, unless there are video visitation that can be done from a home and not from the jail facility itself. So that certainly is probably the quickest thing that can be done to limit the contact exposure with the public, with inmates and inmates with the public. Next slide, please. So a vast amount of our inmates who have cycled out of the jail are on parole or probation. So probation and parole officers have the same current concerns as law enforcement personnel in the streets and jail personnel and courthouse personnel. It's having contact with people who are cycling out of the jail who may be infected or spreading the infection to the public. So 40 current and former probation and parole officials recently released a statement calling for officers to A, immediately limit office visits to people on parole and probation, B, suspend technical violations for the duration of the coronavirus. 45% of prison admissions are due to revocation. So this is a significant group that we're talking about. Reduce intake on probation and parole to only those who absolutely need to be under supervision. Reduce the terms of probation and parole to only as long as necessary to achieve the goals of supervision. Parole commissioners can speed up hearings for compassionate release. The same types of procedures that we were talking about, identifying elderly or at risk, can be done in these circumstances. And we can, the parole board can be also used as a tool to limit the amount of people in our facilities. So next slide. Before we go to questions, I think I would just like to sum up by saying I have been, through my law enforcement career, involved in almost every aspect of law enforcement, from the investigative side, the prosecution side, the sheriff's side, and also as a defense attorney, as I am presently. The system, it takes a system to make criminal justice work, and it's going to take that same sort of cooperation. You need more concentrated effort with some degree of concern to limit the amount of people coming in and remaining in jail. It's not the typical way that things are done. And I know, having gone through these kind of emergency situations in the past, it's very clear that that when these kind of situations occur, that the system is at its best when required, when the public emergencies require them to go outside their normal parameters to limit the possible consequences of the emergency. Here, this emergency has been a slow-moving one, but it's here. It's ready to wash over us, and what we do now will determine how serious this virus affects our community, our public, our country, our local criminal justice system. So I encourage all of you who are presently in the criminal justice system, and those of you who are interested, to urge those judges, court personnel, sheriffs, police chiefs, to take this situation seriously and to implement some of the suggestions that have been made here in this presentation. I'm now available for questions if we have any.
Thank you so much, Sheriff Manfre. That was excellent. And for everyone who is reeling from the whirlwind of suggestions sort of across the criminal justice spectrum, we will be sending out a follow-up materials. And many of you have noticed there's a number of resources in the chats that have gone out, and those will be linked in the follow-up document. So don't worry about having to copy and paste everything that's coming in and sort of try to capture it now. We will be providing that in follow-up. And we're not the only ones even to do a webinar on this. People are really coming together to create materials, interactive resources, share best practices, and help spread it around the country. So, anything that you send to me, we'll be able to share with the group, et cetera. So don't worry that, with the follow-up materials, hopefully the specific things that are happening in jurisdictions around the country, we'll be able to share that with you directly. But as far as the questions, we do have some questions that are really focused on Sheriff, your experience. The first one that I wanted to ask was, with the hurricane, was it possible to react quickly and to scale in a way that, where you didn't have that much time, you could actually make changes with a justice system that's not known for making changes extremely quickly?
Well, again, I've spent almost 28 years in government at some point of my career, and also on the outside, looking in as defense attorney. And we are skeptical about government's ability to respond quickly. But having been through this multiple times, it is incredible how quickly the system can act when there are emergencies that are pushing them to react. And I saw it in each and every instance, the disparate groups of prosecutors and judges and sheriffs and defense attorneys come together. Now, our system is set up to be adversarial, right? So it's not typical that they coordinate. But when it comes to emergency preparedness, a completely different mindset takes over, and everyone is in for all of what they have to do to ensure the public safety. No one wants to be responsible for one person's injury or death because we didn't respond quickly enough. But it's been my experience when it comes to emergency preparedness, a completely different attitude takes over, and maybe a different part of our brain, our sense of the common good takes over, as opposed to our individual needs. And I think my situation in every instance, especially I saw it so succinctly when that Cat 5 was hurtling at us, how you get people's attention. People who normally were at the beach and wouldn't respond to any sort of pleas for evacuation. When they heard that a Cat 5 was coming, they then responded to law enforcement's requests very quickly. So there is something about a sense of crisis that changes human behavior. And it certainly, I think, in this particular circumstance with coronavirus, is changing attitudes very quickly and will lead to successful conclusions.
Thank you. On those same lines, we had a question about, in addition to, let's say, release, for somebody who is released but may not have any place to go, may not have money for even food, for rent, were there modifications you were able to make, whether it was increasing the money given to somebody upon release, that you used in those situations, or that could be used?
Well, I think what happened in the hurricanes, and I'm sure what's going to happen in all our communities, and that's a great question, by the way, and so was the one before it, is that communities start sending up temporary facilities. So in Flagler County and in many counties throughout the country, school districts, which are obviously closed during emergencies, are utilized for temporary housing. And they are set up with law enforcement security. They're set up with beds. They're set up with food. So schools are a pretty good place to set up temporary housing in an emergency. And that may be one of the things that happens in this instance when, for this particular reason, or even for hospitals, if hospitals get overwhelmed and we have to set up temporary medical facilities. If you don't have hospital ships coming to your community like New York and California, apparently, there may be other alternatives that communities will have to consider, and public buildings like schools or county centers, community centers may be utilized for both temporary housing and potential as temporary medical facilities.
Thank you. Thank you. And then let's say after the experience of the hurricane, were there things that had to happen afterward sort of to restore the order in the system, or was it a pretty smooth transition after these quick measures had been taken?
Well, it depended on the degree of damage to the community. So and I'm sure this is going to be the same thing here, is that, there is, again, a bell curve in terms of response. It takes a little slow for the response to occur. It reaches a peak, and it doesn't just fall off straight away. It slowly comes back. So if they're going to be in the hurricane situation where there was a lot of damage, even though there wasn't a lot of injuries or death, there was still a lot of damage that impeded people from being able to utilize the roadways, or people who did have to be medically removed from their homes. So there's a period of time where you try to keep people in their homes. So you allow emergency first responders to react to whatever damage was done, and also city functions, clearing roadways and so forth. And I think the same thing will happen here, is that even when the coronavirus crests, there will be, it's not just, when it's not going to spring back the next day to normalcy. Schools and businesses and prisons and courthouses will take some time to ramp back up to the normalcy that they had before. So whatever time it takes to get to that point is going to be the same time that you're going to have return back to normalcy. So if it takes us 2 months to reach our peak, it's going to take at least 2 months on the other side to return to some normalcy. It's just not going to happen overnight, in my opinion, based on my experience with hurricanes. It took us a week to prepare. It took us a week to get back to normal behavior. And you wanted that. You didn't want all of a sudden everyone just to turn on the light switch and start coming out of their homes until everything was safe.
Thank you. We had a specific question. I don't know if you had work release programs, but how to manage work release programs in a situation like this.
I think all those things would have to be suspended, whether it's work release or I think you would just suspend, again, with the court's approval, because they're the ones who ordered or approved the work release programs, or even the community service programs that are often part of sentencing or conditions that are set by the court. Those all would probably be suspended during this period of time, simply because all of those things required some sort of interaction with probation or other people. So that probably is the most likely thing that will happen. I'm sure the individual court systems will probably come out with some declaration that those type of programs are suspended, pending the results of this pandemic.
Thank you. You mentioned people reaching out to local law enforcement to share these concerns with them and recommendations with them. And someone is wondering if something that could help law enforcement feel the urgency of acting would be to talk about the potential for lawsuits. I don't know if this is something that people in your experience respond to, or if that is really a danger of the potential for lawsuits in a case where facility does not act and then tragedies happen.
Yeah, I mean, this might sound weird coming from a lawyer who sues people for a living, but yeah, I think that should not be the default position. At this point, all of our public officials are acutely aware of what their responsibilities are, and what happens if they don't properly respond. I don't believe lawsuits at this point are the best way to go. I think simple inquiries to our mayors, to our sheriffs, to our governors, those people who are in charge, our county managers or county executives, urging them to do everything in their capacity to limit the exposure, in this case, of inmates to the potential coronavirus and therefore their spread into the community, is the right way to go. I mean, there may not every community has some sort of portal to communicate with public officials. That's where I would start. If within weeks, if that's not occurring, I'm sure the legal community will start isolating those people who negligently did not take their duties to heart and did not react appropriately, especially if it resulted in injury or deaths. So I would say that process will probably be delayed a little bit and hopefully will not be needed. That our community leaders will take this seriously. I think they are now, and let's hope they effectuate some of the proposals we talked about here and the proposals that the CDC and our infectious disease experts are indicating need to happen immediately.
Thank you. There was a question about if sheriffs are able to, like you mentioned, releasing people within a month of the end of their sentence or 2 months. Is that something that sheriffs are able to do, or is there need to be coordination with, let's say, judges?
Yeah, the sheriffs do not, at least in Florida, and I believe in most jurisdictions, do not have the ability just to release people without court approval. Courts are the determinant factor in sentencing prisoners and creating conditions. Law enforcement can recommend, prosecutors can recommend, but our system is built on levels of laws, and the legal system gives judges the authority to set the conditions of pretrial release, of sentencing, and probation. So that is the authority that has to be utilized in order to, release inmates prior to the end of their sentences. And courts are very responsive to this. They understand, just as community leaders do, the importance of limiting amount of people in prisons during emergencies. So I found them to be very responsive. They're community people. They have they live in the community, so they're trying to achieve the same results. Is to ensure that the crisis doesn't overwhelm the community.
Thank you. You had mentioned the we're all very familiar with cases where authorities are talking about curfews and increasing sort of the trying to mandate social distancing, and in some cases threatening arrest and jail for curfews. I don't know what happens in cases of hurricanes, but is this something, how do you manage the need to make people realize that something is serious with the challenge of not wanting to arrest more people?
Law enforcement officers are professionals, and they are trained for this kind of situation. They're trained in conflict resolution. They're trained in de-escalating techniques. So yeah, I mean, what happens is when curfews are set, there are bars and people, or when there's evacuation orders, there are people. Some people do not comply. Law enforcement this is what they do. This is what they do every day, and they're very familiar with how to encourage without arrest, with the threat of arrest, but encourage people to conform to the laws. And I'm very confident. Throughout this country, have about 1 million or so law enforcement officers. They will respond appropriately in the situations. If people are a threat to the public because of a failure to comply, they will use whatever means necessary to get them to comply. There is a force continuum, as we say in law enforcement, and they will use that continuum. Starting with verbal requests and escalating to threats, and if it's absolutely required and there's no other way for the situation to be resolved, then an arrest would be effectuated. But obviously, we're trying in every instance to avoid that. And again, I think the public, in my experience, in all avenues from New York City to Long Island to Florida, city, suburban, and rural areas, they also come together in crisis. There's always a few who will not conform regardless of what's going on, but for the most part, the public are your friends in these kind of situations because they understand what's at risk.
On that same note, did you find increases of lawlessness where people would recognize that the law was not being enforced during a particular period, or that there was a decrease because, as you said, people sort of come together in a time of crisis?
Yeah, as I always tell people, I don't mean to be funny, but the way to reduce crime is for it to rain. Crime goes down dramatically when it's raining. Crime goes down dramatically when it's windy. Crime goes down dramatically in hurricanes. Crime goes down dramatically in crises, simply because of people they act differently. They're not out and about. They're not congregating. So crime goes down. The only area probably where there is some sort of increase in crime is in the homes. People forced to be inside for long periods of time. Sometimes you get some more domestic violence issues because people can't get out. But those are minor. And my sense of it is that people react appropriately to the situation. And my experience, and others may have had different experiences, is that crime goes down and people do conform for the greater good.
So to follow up on that, so in Philadelphia, the police have announced, we won't be making arrests for certain crimes. So you wouldn't be concerned about publicizing exactly which offenses will not be, subject to arrest during this time, as opposed to, I believe, cite and release.
Again, you have to. There are risks you have to take for the greater risk, which is spreading the virus. It's not that there's no risk in advertising that. It's not that no one will take advantage. It's just, again, my optimistic nature. It's my experience that even the criminal element conforms to this. And by the way, because in these situations, there are so few people on the street. If you're doing crimes, there's a lot more law enforcement available because they're not as busy doing other things, responding to the typical calls. So not a great idea to commit crimes, in these circumstances, because first of all, law enforcement is usually there's usually more law enforcement available. They're usually less busy, and they can more concentrate on quality of life crimes in these circumstances. So I'm not saying there's no risk, but I think the higher risk of this pandemic and potential elderly and people at risk falling victim to this virus, I think trumps that whatever risk there is in advertising, not arresting these crimes.
Thank you. Another question was related to the reaction when someone is homeless and there's a plan to release people. If somebody who's homeless is doesn't have somewhere to go, people have said, well, maybe it's better to keep them incarcerated. How did you deal with people who are homeless in a disaster situation?
Well, in a lot of communities, unfortunately, it was our community, as much as I pushed for it, we did not have halfway houses. A lot of communities have halfway houses that before, when people are released from the facility, they go to a halfway house where they get, some counseling, perhaps job counseling, perhaps housing counseling before they go out. In most facilities, there is some type of social worker inside the facility that will help them with those kind of issues if they have them. In many facilities, including ours, we had clergy, chaplains who were assigned to the inmate facility, along with a variety of other denominations who would assist in meaningful ways in ministering to the inmates. And so those resources are also utilized. A lot of the churches, particularly here in the South, where I believe church community is a little bit more recognized and counted on, they become partners in these kind of situations. So if there isn't halfway houses, if you don't have a strong clergy community, it goes back to the community's efforts in creating temporary housing for homeless people. Obviously, I could talk all day about the homeless issue. I'm involved in that locally, trying to create temporary housing for homeless people is key to our homeless issue, and in this particular circumstances. As anyone who is knowledgeable with this field knows, that the solution to housing is housing. Solution to homeless people is housing. If you give them houses, they're not homeless anymore. A lot of reasons why they're homeless is simply they can't afford any housing. And that's another issue we're going to have to grapple with in our country one day.
You mentioned the issue around visitation, and even in a place where, in a situation where family members would have to congregate in a lobby to do video conferencing, that itself is problematic for social distancing. And so there was a concern around how this would impact the mental health of people who are in the facilities from being cut off from visits for people whose families don't have the capacity to do video visits that would from home.
Yeah, it is a challenge because what has occurred is a lot of libraries have had computers, so where people didn't have transportation to inmate facilities, and for the most part, inmate facilities are in remote locations. Very few of them are in downtown areas, so it is a challenge for some people to get to those facilities to do either video visitation or in-person visitation. So in a lot of instances where people do not have that ability, they could use libraries, computers to video visit. So yeah, it's an issue. It's a challenge. But again, the larger issue of keeping people from interacting during this next 30 days, I think, overrules any of these considerations. Look, mental health is such a huge issue in our inmate facilities. Again, I could do a webinar on inmate facilities, mental health. Simply, we did away with so many mental health institutions in the 80s that it now is the inmate facilities at default mental health centers. When I was a sheriff, half of our prison population was taking some sort of psychotropic medications. So it's a huge issue, and the isolation of the mentally ill is a huge problem. And the solution to that is diverting them outside the jail, again, into mental health facilities as opposed to jails where there is absolutely no ability to properly care for the mentally ill. And we did that when I was a sheriff. We diverted people, sentenced prisoners, out of the jail into outpatient treatment programs, and we got almost a 90% success rate of not reoffending. So we do have to do a better job of dealing with the mentally ill, and certainly isolation by not having visitation is not going to make the situation any better.
A similar issue is around telemedicine, or the challenge of medical care when it's difficult for medical professionals to come in and out. And some facilities have been closing off normal, not just family visits, but visits of whether it's counselors, doctors, et cetera, to try to stop the spread of the virus. And I was wondering if you could respond to that issue.
Yeah, I think telemedicine is going to play a huge part. And the president was asked that question today about telemedicine. I think telemedicine is a time its time has come because how weak our healthcare system is nationally. But it's a time that has come in this particular crisis, and it also may be utilized very heavily in prison populations. For those who are not familiar with inmate facilities, there are really only two ways really to deal with it. Is you have your own personnel that you've hired as nurses or doctors to care for the sick in the prison, or you hire a company that does it. So for those facilities that have companies, provide medical care to the facility, it'll be interesting to see how they react to this. They may react with more telemedicine offers to the jail administrators and sheriffs, provide that level simply because they're not going to have enough doctors to provide for all the sick that are in that jail once the coronavirus hits. So I think that's where the telemedicine really is going to be implemented, is with these large companies that provide medical care to inmate facilities.
Thank you. Another question was about the role of governors who have clemency powers, and if that is an appropriate way to deal with, let's say, the issue of elderly, medically frail.
Yeah, I think it is. It's incumbent upon state correctional facilities to be identifying the at-risk population in their jails, whether they are elderly or have some health risk, and making a list, and the governors reviewing those lists and declaring clemency for those people who are not a risk to the community, but are at high risk for either contracting or spreading the coronavirus. So I think that is a valid and important process that governors are probably being advised right now to consider. And I'm sure the state correction system and the federal system as well are looking into those type of possibilities to reduce their prison populations. If they're not, they should be.
Thank you. We did have a question about, you mentioned your book. If you could share the title of your book, if people want to learn more about your transition from prosecutor to sheriff.
Well, right now I've just written a fictional account. It's called Southern Storm by James Manfre. I'm in the process of sort of outlining my autobiography about how I became sheriff in a rural county as a Yankee prosecutor. To be honest with you, I think the nonfiction account is probably more sensational than the fictional account, because it's hard to make up the facts that brought me to being the sheriff twice in this community. Yeah, Southern Storm is my fictional account of dealing with the rural community. And again, 125,000 people live in a rural community, but when I started as sheriff in 2001, our community was 45,000 people, and it's grown by 80,000 people. And by the time my second term, I had an 8-year period where I was not the sheriff. So it's an interesting county.
Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing all of this information for us, and on short notice. I just wanted to ask one final quick question, which is just, are you willing, if people have further questions, you willing to reply to people's further questions so that you can kind of be a resource going forward?
Yeah, my short answer is yes. My longer answer is, I do want to give Leap some credit for all that you do, and it's one of my great honors in my life to be part of this organization of judges and prosecutors and sheriffs and police chiefs and corrections officials. It's in coordination with Leap. I'd be happy to do that, but I do want to thank you, Amos, for all your work in helping me prepare this, and Neil for his leadership in Leap, and the entire staff who I've worked with repeatedly at conferences. And it's a real honor to work with professionals. And I think the work we're doing, not only here, but throughout the criminal justice reform movement, is one of great import. And you all should be given all the credit in the world for everything you do each day.
Well, thank you so much. We absolutely feel the same way.
Thank you, Jim.
Yeah, Neil, I wanted to just turn it back to you to close us out, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Amos. Yeah, thanks again, Jim, for doing this for us. You know, this webinar series, it's really important now with what's going on and the social distancing and the conferences that have been canceled, and we don't know how long this is going to go on. So, Amos, you may not want to hear this, but we may have to step up our webinar series and get more information out there to people, since we're not going to be traveling around doing it the way we normally do it, increase our writing and so on. But anyway, I want to thank also all of our viewers that joined us today and who continue to join us in the future, have joined us in the past. This is important work, as you can see. Again, Jim, great presentation, very well done. And I hope that folks really keep an eye on what's going on in their areas of responsibility, places where they live, working with their prosecutors, working with their corrections officials and other folks, and dealing with this issue that we have within our prisons as it relates to COVID-19. And again, be safe, practice your social distancing, and hopefully we'll get through this as quickly as possible with limited damage socially as well as economically for our country. So thanks again, everyone. Thanks, Amos, for all your hard work.
Thank you, Neil. Bye, everyone.
Take care, everyone.